All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome to Amii HQ. For those who I haven't met, my name is Cam Linke. I'm the CEO here at Amii. And we're pleased to welcome everybody today, both to our office here and to our friends who've tuned in online on the live stream. Many of you probably know about Amii, but for those who don't, Amii's one of Canada's 3 national centers of artificial intelligence. We're tasked with advancing Canada's AI potential, and we're proud to collaborate with the University of Alberta on driving Amii's AI research excellence forward. We're really excited to have everyone here today for this special announcement from our Chief Scientific Advisor, Rich Sutton. Before we get started, we'd like to respectfully acknowledge that we're on Treaty 6 territory, a traditional gathering place for the diverse Indigenous peoples, including the Cree, Blackfoot, Métis, Nakota Sioux, Haudenosaunee, Dene, Ojibwe, Saulteaux, Anishinaabe, Inuit, and many other peoples whose histories, languages, and cultures continue to influence our vibrant community. And it's in the spirit of that exchange of knowledge and of that gathering that we're excited to welcome everyone here today. At Amii, we're really excited to support our friend and mentor, Rich Sutton. There's so much that could be said about Rich and the pioneering work that he's done in reinforcement learning and AI. The span of Rich's impact is almost hard to enumerate, from his dedication to fundamental research and the advancement of the science of AI to his efforts to train the next generation of AI researchers. His book, Reinforcement Learning: An Introduction, has both educated and inspired scores of graduate students and beyond, and is one of the most approachable people in the field, always having time for researchers, for curious observers, and for everyone in between to sit down, have a discussion, discuss reinforcement learning, discuss artificial intelligence. He's one of the people that, while many people have already left either the party or the conference, Rich will be in the corner somewhere having a conversation with someone about reinforcement learning, about some nuance of the field. And one of the things we talk about here a lot at Amii is approachability, and that approachability is something that we've really been inspired by Rich from. And speaking of pioneers, the guest I'd like to invite up with Rich has trailblazed multiple fields. Among his list of pioneering accomplishments are co-founding id Software, and his leading work there in computer graphics and computer gaming created an entire genre of gaming. Since then, John's also known for his work in rocketry and ushering in a modern era of virtual reality with Oculus Rift. So we're so excited to have them both here at Amii HQ, and everyone please join me in welcoming John Carmack and Rich Sutton to the stage.
Thank you so much, Cam. It's a delight to speak to you all this afternoon. Today, I am pleased to announce the formation of a partnership between John Carmack and myself to work directly towards the challenge of understanding and creating an artificial general intelligence based on reinforcement learning and neural networks. The partnership will be embodied within Keen Technologies, which is a startup that John created about a year ago. And as of today, I'm an employee of that company. Of course, I will continue as professor at the University of Alberta and as the Chief Scientific Advisor at Amii, the Alberta Machine Intelligence Institute that you're all here at. So I'm very excited to be partnering with John. John is the world's preeminent developer of complex, high-performance real-time systems. His skill and brilliance was first demonstrated in technical innovations in 2D and 3D graphics and in computer games such as Doom and Quake. His engineering skills were honed on rockets at Armadillo Aerospace and by his work on immersive virtual reality at Oculus. Roughly 5 years ago, John became, he turned to the challenge of artificial general intelligence, and that eventually led to Keen. Now, when I first learned about John and Keen earlier this year, I was struck by how aligned I was with him, despite, my having done this all my life, and John just turning to it a few years ago. There are many aspects to the way we are so strongly aligned, but let me identify just 4 of them. We both strongly felt that the field of artificial general intelligence was dominated by too narrow a set of ideas. This was groupthink, and this groupthink was to be avoided. We both strongly felt that trying to make money too soon was like an off-ramp on the road to AGI, and we need to keep our eyes on the long-term prize of full AGI. Eyes on the prize. And number 3, artificial general intelligence is not too complex for one person to understand the principles of it or even to write the code for it. That is an important part of our alignment. And finally, 2030 is a good target to have a success, to have a prototype AGI, to show signs of life. We're a toddler, as John likes to say. So John and I are really well aligned. And but there's a sort of an elephant in the room, and it's become clear. Keen is a small team. The entire technical team of Keen Technologies is here today, and it's John and me and Gloria and Lucas. If you could stand up, and also Joseph, who's we expect to join us by the end of the year, and now all these Keen people are now part of our community. And could you all give them a good Alberta applause? Thank you for that. So the elephant in the room is that this is a small team, and other companies have thousands of technical staff and are spending billions of dollars on AGI. It's truly audacious of us to think that we can make a contribution. It's audacious of us to think we can compete with them. And we think we can, or at least we can make a contribution. There's much to say about why that might be reasonable to think, and I'm going to refrain from trying to explain it. But I will only remind you of what Margaret Mead said. She said, "Never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed people can change the world. Indeed, it is the only thing that ever has." Now I'd like to turn the floor over to John to say a few words. The legendary John Carmack.
So a couple months ago, I got an email from Richard Sutton. I'm like, well, this is cool. So I am relatively new to the artificial intelligence field. And when I started kind of my larval phase, as I like to call it, where I just inhale all of the relevant information in kind of the first year, one of the very important references for me was Richard's book on reinforcement learning. And in fact, I later went through the first half of it again with my son doing exercises just a couple years ago. And of course, I reference the bitter lesson all the time as one of the deep fundamental insights to the kind of broader effort of everything that goes on here. So Richard was trying to figure out kind of like how he should be pursuing his efforts towards research across different options in commercial, academic, and nonprofit. And I wanted to be super helpful. I hooked him up with a few other people, and I tried to kind of give him whatever help that I could. But I did very tentatively kind of broach the subject that, all right, you're the godfather of reinforcement learning. You can write your own ticket anywhere you want to go work. But there are some downsides to especially larger established organizations. And you may get access to lots of resources and still have the freedom to do whatever you want. But there are problems with culture and direction, kind of strategic direction in other areas. It's why, as flattered as I was when OpenAI tried to recruit me, I respect all that they do, but they've got their plan, they've got their directions. It's not really what I'm doing. And there began a little process of kind of feeling out, well, exactly how do you feel about certain of these directions? Like, what are the odds of technologies going this way? How important is this? How important is that? And it turned out that we really did have a remarkable amount of overlap in what we think is possible, what we think the remaining challenges are. And, to be clear, nobody has line of sight on the solution to this today, but we feel, and a number of other people, that it's not that much left. There are things we don't know how to get there, but they all feel like the same scope of things that mattered in this last decade. They're relatively simple things in the way that you set up your architectures, the way you do your training, the way you query it in different ways. And I certainly think that in 30 years, when the textbook of artificial general intelligence is written, it's going to get digested down to a chapter that people are going to be able to understand. We just need to figure out what those sort of core ideas are. So it was really still to my great surprise, but immense pleasure, that we have decided to go ahead and work on this together. So Richard is working at Keen Technologies now. He's in our workplace, and we spent all day today basically talking about the plan of research, how we want to start figuring out what we're going to be doing. So this is incredibly exciting for me. And if you'd like to say anything else, Richard?
Thank you, John. I think now we'd like to take questions from the media. And this will use a mic. Good.
Okay. So we're going to open up the floor for any media questions. So for the media in the room, if you have a question, please come over here. And for media on the line, so operator, please open up the line for the first question. Oh, there's no media on the phone. Any media questions from the room?
Oh, fantastic. Here you are.
Hi, Mrinali Anshan with CBC Edmonton. So following this partnership, I'm wondering if you could talk about some of the tangible steps that are going to be taken to kind of develop AGI more.
So one of the big points that we do have alignment on is that there's not any near-term off-ramps here where there's not going to be a ChatGPT-like deliverable that goes out and wows the world, where there are fundamental research questions that need to be answered. And this is me learning how to be a researcher and hopefully learning from Richard a lot about that process. But we have internal projects and kind of angles of attack on things, but they probably will not have a lot of publicly visible effects for likely years. We are fairly aligned on this sort of, we are 6, 7, 8 years out from something really big and important being publicly visible. Anything?
That's perfect. Next question.
Yeah, I have a follow-up. So for the average person, obviously there's a lot of terminology thrown around. Why should the average person care about this, if you can describe in the most simple terms?
Well, I would say the average person probably shouldn't care a whole lot about this. This is something, this is inside baseball work for people that are in the field. A lot of people are going to be geeking out about this, where, Rich is a big name, big personage, and I'm a big name in a very different field, and we're kind of coming together, and I do think there's synergistic benefits for that, and it's kind of exciting just as a two great taste great together, sort of mix things up between the, different backgrounds. But I don't want us to try to make this out to be something that the man in the street should actually care about. It may yet lead to one of the most important things in the world or in history, but there's very little guarantees about any of that. And that's the benefit of the way we're financed and the way we're structured right now. We don't have to have a rush to a product. We don't have to have a rush to make sure that there's an investor return in a very short amount of time. We can concentrate on just trying to answer these critical, important questions.
Okay.
Cool.
Great. Any other questions? Fantastic. That concludes the Q&A portion of the program. Oh, yes, Reg.
If we're done, I have a few things I want to say.
Please.
Before we close, I want to thank Amii and the University of Alberta for the help today, particularly Stephanie Enders and Laura Carter and Cam and Linda Vang. express my appreciation for the entire Edmonton and Alberta community for all they do in creating the rich intellectual environment in which I and this part of Keene can thrive. The community has supported fundamental research in AI for 30 years before I came here. And this is bearing fruit now in Amii and in industry and in startup companies and more fundamental research results. Please join me in a huge round of applause for Amii and for yourselves, the entire AI community. And with that, I want to turn the floor over to someone else. Cam, there you are.
All right. Well, thanks, everyone. How about one big round of applause for Rich and John again? So thank you, everyone, for joining us today. That concludes the program for the announcement. We're going to reset the room for the fireside chat. So if everyone can do us a favor, I know this is a pain, but we need you to all leave the room, continue the conversation. Everybody can have their favorite conversation about what took place here today. Head over to the co-working space in the cafe. We have food and drinks and caffeine to really amp you up for this next portion. If you've RSVP'd for the fireside chat, we'll readmit you shortly. So please do us a favor, move over there, tour our beautiful space, and we'll see you back here shortly. Thanks. All right. Okay, we're gonna get going. Welcome to the second half of the show. If you can do us a favor, if you're on the edge of the row, please squeeze into the middle. That will help as stragglers come in, not doing the excuse me, pardon me, and distracting the speakers. Or just me. So do me a favor, squeeze into the middle, help us out. Thank you very much. Get close, get to know your neighbor. Welcome back. For those who missed the earlier part of this, I'm Cam Linke. I'm the CEO here at Amii. We're excited to welcome you back to the second part of our doubleheader with a special fireside chat. So our host for the night is well known for his love of games. Yes, loves games. An Amii Fellow, Canada CIFAR AI Chair, and full professor at the University of Alberta. Mike is best known for his work in poker, most notably solving the game of Heads Up No Limit Texas Hold'em in 2015, and for Deep Stack in 2016, the first AI to beat human professionals at Heads Up No Limit Texas Hold'em. I think I made an error in there that Mike's gonna correct. He's glaring at me. We're so excited for Mike to be our host and to host our special guest tonight. And so I don't make any more errors, please welcome Mike Bowling to the stage.
Thank you very much, Cam. I'm sorry, I do have to correct you. So we did essentially solve Heads Up Limit, and we beat the first to beat professional players at Heads Up No Limit. Okay, but you're not here for that. I get to have the great honor of introducing John Carmack. Many people have already said wonderful words about him, but maybe you weren't here for that. I'll just say that he's a pretty big deal, maybe a BFD, if you will. But I'll just say my first connection to John was probably my first memory of seeing something really innovative was thanks to John. Because if you're really young, you can't see innovation. Everything is new. So you didn't know what came before, so you don't know this changed things. And when I was 17, I went to a gaming convention, and there sitting was rows of computers. This wasn't even a video game convention. It was board games and role-playing games. And there sitting was rows of computers with Wolfenstein 3D running on them in the summer of 1992, and my mind was blown. So thank you, John Carmack, and welcome to the stage.
Welcome, John.
Thank you.
Doesn't seem to be on. We need to do something.
Oh, I'm supposed to push the button. Okay. Yeah, when I was asked to do this, I was trying to think through. I felt like I had a lot of pressure on me to ask you really insightful questions for the audience, but I decided I'm going to kind of almost ignore the audience. I'm just going to ask you the questions I feel like I want to ask you totally selfishly, and I'm going to hope because I have a love of games, I have a love of innovation and I have a love for AI, that maybe these are the questions that the audience wants to hear too. So I want to walk you back to the beginnings of id and Wolfenstein 3D. And maybe you can say some words about how did you even end up at that place? And then I want to turn around and talk a bit more about innovation from there.
Yeah, so it did. Games were super important for me in my childhood. I loved the arcade games. I loved the early 8-bit video games and the tabletop games, all of that. And so it did seem obvious to me that this love of computers that I had, that the best way to express it was through games. Now, it is important to kind of differentiate a little bit there, where there are a lot of people that go into gaming and they learn about computers so they can make games. And it was a little more fortuitous for me because I had this intrinsic love of computers as well. And I probably could have been happy and found interest in doing more mundane things, but the games were there. They were the obvious place, and it turned out to work, really well for me. And so I had been, from the first time I could do anything on a computer, I was trying to write games. I was trying to, at first mimic some of the other games that I would see, the early text adventure games, writing my dungeon crawlers, kind of inspired by Wizardry and Ultima and the early things like that. But as I got to be a teenager and I built the assembly language skills and started figuring out how to do the sort of the real world things, and I had a talent for it. I got good at it, and I had decided that I wanted to actually try to make a living making games. And there was a lean year there of barely scraping by doing contract programming work before I accepted the position to come down and work at Soft Disk Publishing, where I met the other founders of id Software. And we started out making our initial side-scroller games, which was Commander Keen, which I have kind of harkened back to with the name of my latest company, with Keen Technologies. But then we really broke out and kind of made our name with the 3D games. And I always did kind of look at that as the games were the same things that you could do in 2D, but the change in perspective of going to 3D, it made a qualitative difference. Even if sort of symbolically it was the same game, but it made a great difference in the impact it had on people.
100%. Tell me more about that jump to 3D. Was that intentional? Were you, I could think of so many ways this could have gone, where you could have just been like, that seems like a hard, challenging computers problem, and so I'm going to solve that, versus feeling like this is the future of games, so we need to innovate in that front, versus not even realizing maybe that you were being innovative. Like, how did that work?
Now, I knew I was heading for that from the early 80s. Even as a young teenager, you would see the representations of 3D graphics are in the movie, and you see Tron, or you see 3D animated logos. I can remember making little wireframe MTV logos spin around on my Apple II, kind of figuring out these basics. And looking back, I didn't know how to do clipping at the time, so nothing can get close to the edge of the screen. It just has to stay in the center and rotate around. But that idea of wanting to be inside the video game, I mean, everybody that's a gamer kind of got that sense of you look at the game, you play the game, you appreciate it, but how amazing would it be to put yourself inside it and then see the enemies coming at you rather than looking down at it as that 16 by 16 block of pixels. And that was magical. And you could take exactly the same game and put the user inside it. And that really followed on even more with virtual reality later on, where getting the sense of presence where you kind of believe that you're in this other environment. So that was always a big issue for me. But it is important to say that that's kind of the obvious visible thing that stands out, that there was a time period where there was nothing else like that. But there are 1,000 good decisions that go into making a game. And it was never about just the technology. It was about doing those 1,000 things right. All the subtleties about how you feel, how you move, how the guns react, what the sound effect is. There's 10 things you layer on top of every action that happens in a game to wind up giving it this really good feel. And most of them will be things that people don't even notice. I mean, everybody points to, oh my God, this 3D black magic that was going on that left people just wondering how they could compete with something like that until, engine technologies got out there. But there were plenty of other now forgotten games that wound up having flashy 3D graphics, but people don't remember them because they didn't do all the other things right.
I mean, I definitely remember the just smoothness of the original id games were just blew people away. Like, it felt like you could play them as opposed to being pulled out of the immersion from the clunkiness. But that's also innovative technology too, right? That's
and some of the things that were actually subtle that were really important to me, and nobody actually called these out, but in terms of the graphics, the way they were rendered, there were a lot of 3D games that had this kind of non-solid feel to it, where there are these subtle things that have to do with pixel centers and avoiding cracks between polygons. And you can still make great games for that. Like the entire PlayStation 1 set of titles was all done with this integer snapped, affine interpolated rendering technology. And you can do good things with that, but I always took pride in the solidity, the kind of sense that everything was really rock solid there, where some games felt fragile, like, you bump the wrong way and you're gonna slide through the wall, get caught, and see a flickering mess of stuff. And for the most part, we took great pains to make that not happen in ours.
That's awesome. Is there anything else that you think this was the innovative part, but in the decades later, no one remembers that being the innovation?
Well, what was great is we had this period of this 5-year period during the development going from Wolfenstein 3D to Doom to Quake. And there were so many things that wound up setting the tone for gaming for the following 30-something years. And things like the multiplayer gaming, the modding, these were not the flashy 3D graphics technology, but they were things that were super valuable, and it was happy to see people follow up on it. Even little things like having a console, having the override ability for the different data sets. There were a lot of decisions like that that worked out pretty well. And I could imagine a world where 3D graphics was inevitable. It was being done on higher end systems, offline rendering. But it is possible to imagine a contingent set of history where you didn't wind up with this action-oriented things, because the dominant vision was you do sims. You do flight sims, driving sims, tank sims, destroyer sims. And this idea of this run and gun, really fast-paced action, twitch reaction, the whipping around the mouse directly at inhuman speeds, and all of these things, that might not have happened without id Software in the early days.
I wonder just how much that affected the development, even get to where we are today in terms of we've seen gaming drive technology a lot, right? So would we have GPUs today? Would we be sitting on top of AI, on top of deep learning, sitting on top of GPUs today, if we didn't have those initial games saying we could have action-oriented, broader open games? Do you think that's a possibility?
So the GPU side
I'm just flattering you, but
I do. It's one of those things where I smile and I'll talk about it a little bit. I do take some satisfaction in the fact that the GPUs were largely built to play the Quake series of games at the beginning. And then you had this great insight from Jensen at NVIDIA saying all these pixel processing things that we're doing, we can do other things with them. And they had a lot of foresight to do the long game investment in CUDA and give us the kind of generalized processing. Because people were doing general processing before that in this horrible way. You'd encode your values into pixels, you'd draw a giant triangle that covers the screen to do an array processing action on there. And it was, it was effective a little bit, but it was awful. But the evolution of GPUs to where they are today as this quite general purpose device that does underpin all of the modern era of artificial intelligence, it's nice to, even if I wound up not working in artificial intelligence, it would be something that I'm proud of, that I at least contributed at some point to that evolution.
I have one more question of curiosity from this time that relates to Wolfenstein itself. So I played the original Wolfenstein games and Beyond Wolfenstein and loved them. How did this, did you have that IP in mind and then we're designing a game for it? Did you have the game first? What was the order of events and yeah, how did that come
all of
about?
us at id, John, Tom, Jay, and I, we were all Apple II background people. So we all had this background with the original Escape from Castle Wolfenstein. And it was a game that had it was more what you today would think of as a stealth game. You would sneak around, you'd wear guards' uniforms, you'd drag the bodies out of the way. But it still did have that sense of shooting Nazis. And we had originally thought we were going to do some alien-based game, calling it It's Green and Pissed, just kind of a generic alien shooter. This was following up off of our kind of fantasy-themed Catacombs 3D. But when the idea came up that it's what if we did Wolfenstein 3D? all the good memories for us. It was playing the nostalgia card even for us at that time, some 15 years after that was initially released. And back at that time, I look back and kind of cringe at like our business practices at the time. We did not sort this out very well. We kind of just charged ahead and looked around a little bit thinking, well, maybe the rights are clear. These companies seem bankrupt. We eventually ran into Silas Warner, the original author, at an Apple II convention, and he was delighted to see Wolfenstein something. Of course, he didn't own the rights. His blessing didn't actually mean anything from a legal term, but to us, it felt good to have the original creator kind of bless our effort and what we were doing there. And in the end, we got out of it unscathed, but that was luck involved, I think.
Awesome. Also, in the early times, I feel like it formed another aspect of your career, which is your proponent for open source software. Both in distribution models of how software is distributed were pretty original in those early games. I'm wondering what's your trajectory through that? What's your thoughts about open source, say, then and now, and what connections there are between them?
So probably the most formative book of my teenage years was Stephen Levy's book, Hackers, Heroes of the Computer Revolution. And, I read it dog-eared, and it had these major themes about the hacker ethic and the kind of sharing of information and communal use of code in different ways. And this was before open source became what it is today, or even before the Free Software Foundation kind of had their mission and coined the term. So that was pretty deeply in me early on, and it was fortunate that John Romero, my kind of co-programmer, had similar feelings about it, that this idea that it's just amazingly cool to be able to share the program to make it possible, where we had these memories of hacking the games, like you'd get Ultima, you'd get your sector editor out, you'd find out, oh, that's my gold, I want 9999 in there. And I remember fervently wishing that I could look at the source code for these things, to be able to go, these games that I adored, that I spent a lot of time on, I wanted to see exactly how they were made. And to get into a position as a small private company, where we owned all of our own IP, the ability to kind of make that earlier childhood wish that I had come true for a whole new generation of programmers was, it was very motivating for me. And it was a drawn out process inside the company, because there's a huge divide generally between the technical and the creative people here, where, it's not a judgmental side of things, but just the technical people tend to get this sharing more than most of the artists and designers do, where there's a lot more worry about chain of credit and, where the work builds upon other people's work. So it was not fully understood by everyone in the company, but, a little bit of it was, I was able to throw a little bit of my weight around in my position. And I know there was a little bit of hard feelings for a while that I did something that they was thinking was bad for the business.
Was this related to the leak of the Quake source code, or are you thinking of a different? Okay.
No, just the open source in general, where there was this point early on where we had released the tools for Doom and the ability to do all of this. And a product came out called D-Zone, which was a CD-ROM just full of hundreds and hundreds of maps. And the people that did that actually made more money than we made on Doom 2, because we did not have a great royalty deal at the time, and they shoveled that out, and there was some genuine bitterness that was possible, and that to some degree I had enabled that by sharing the tools. But I did feel very good that a decade or more goes on, a couple decades now, and the people like Kevin Cloud, who was one of the artists on there, had later told me that, no, that really was all for the best looking back on it. And we are in this almost unique position where Doom will never die. As long as there are processors, Doom will run on them.
Right. Do you think there's lessons to take now? And then, I feel like the open source community has played a role in the last 10-year development of AI. What do you see the lessons that we should learn and thinking about how that connects to the current innovations?
Yeah, I am still surprised that it doesn't play more of a role in the game industry, where I'm genuinely surprised that there is not more full open source development. You see bits of it in the Minecraft mod scene, where you have projects up on GitHub, but people that are generally making games, they still feel very protective of their source. And then you had the commercial companies with Unity coming in and making a very powerful product that gets the job done, that was better than open source alternatives in many cases. I think Epic does a really grand thing they have strict licensing terms, but the fact that the source code is all available, that's half the battle. I am pragmatic. I'm not a purist. I'm not going to license snipe somebody about what they're using. Just having the source code available for view is a large chunk of the value. So there's good stuff there. But in the AI space, it's much more open. And I think in the broader sense of where academia has gone, where I go back and I do read a lot of papers from the 90s and stuff, and it's papers without code, without data, unreproducible. There's a whole lot of things that are just probably are not right. And the path to having the norm, it's still not fully established, and there's still pushback about it, but the world is a far, far better place now for the openness that we do have on the pace of artificial intelligence and most other science that I don't even have windows into. The fact that code available on GitHub, ideally data there, we still have too many cases of data available upon request, and there's still norms that need to be pushed there, because you do still have sensitive people. It's like, oh, if I release this, people will find mistakes, they'll critique my code, they'll have all of this, and that's still a problem being worked through, but I have no complaints about the state that we're at now and the trajectory that we're on. I think it really is one of the great things for the world today.
Cool. I want to jump into AI, but before that, let me take your detour through VR for a minute. Tell me, did that just feel like a natural extension for you for games, or were you thinking something bigger? What was motivating you to move into that space?
I had actually tried some VR stuff back in the 90s. We had one of the really old headsets that cost $10,000 and was like 320 by 240 resolution screens and pixels the size of small footballs in your peripheral vision. And it was clearly not the right time for something there. And it was interesting where I went and I said, I'm just going to go look at the state of VR because it's been 2 decades. Surely it's all fixed by now. And I was really surprised to find that even though technically we had good screens, good accelerometers, we had all the things that seemed to be necessary to make this work, but there were still just this handful of government contractors making headsets. They were $50,000 headsets in some cases, and they still weren't even all that great. And that was one of those points where you can say that opportunity is the difference between what's possible and what people are actually doing. And it did seem there, it's like from a technical level, these things were now possible. And the early experiments that I did there showed that it can also be really quite compelling. Now, there's the obvious play there about, well, you make games, it's more immersive. There's the step from looking at a 2D game to looking at a 3D game to being inside a 3D game. And that is, absolutely true. But I do think there's the even more powerful case about once you have a virtual interface, everything that you do on screens can, at least in theory, be done better in a more flexible way with a virtual reality headset. So I do think there is that many billion-dollar value there. I spent 8 years involved with it, and there's things that I'm very proud of. The Quest 2, the Quest 3 being announced officially and coming out real soon now are great pieces of hardware. And there's an interview that I did 10 years ago in 2012 or 2013 where I'm saying this is the way I want things to go. I want this self-contained device that has inside-out position tracking, not cabled to anything, no external tracking aids, that can run lightweight applications internally all by itself and can connect wirelessly to PCs to go ahead and have higher performance things. And that turned out just the way I wanted, but there was a lot of things that I had friction at Meta with trying to get the rest of the way.
Right. I was gonna ask you. I was sort of thinking about the transition into AI. I don't know how much of that was somewhat being disillusioned by the impact that you wanted to see in VR.
No, it really wasn't. I was still fighting the good fight as much as I could from my position in VR. But it is funny how my origin story for the AI really does go back to Sam Altman and OpenAI trying to recruit me when I knew nothing about the state of AI. And I was very flattered by that they just thought that that my skill set and background could play a useful part in the company that they were building and putting together.
Now, we were talking about that just before we got on stage, but had you already started to look in AI at that point that raised your profile? No, you were just like, they went after you as purely, you are a brilliant engineer, you will help get us the rest of the way there.
Yeah, I had some vague relationship to it for, like, there were hand tracking models and eye tracking and face tracking. Neural nets were used a little bit in the VR side of things, but I had barely touched it. I had done sort of my neural nets in C. I just spent a week just kind of writing that by myself, but that was about it.
Yeah. So they reached out to you, and then that made you think, I should look into this AI stuff then. Is that how it happened?
Exactly. And then I looked into it, and I was very happy. They helped me kind of get my feet under me, and like, here's roughly what you need to learn. And when I started looking into it, I carefully thought about it, and I reached this conclusion that this is probably the highest leverage time for someone like me, an individual engineer, in the history of ever. That there are so many important things that require huge teams of people, that require lots of management, but the gap between where we are now, standing on the shoulders of all those giants, and this really transformative thing with general intelligences applying to almost everything that we do intellectually in the world, that feels like this small, modest number of things. And when I look back at what mattered in the last decade, they all feel like things that I would come up with. So it was exciting.
Yeah, so I think it's kind of funny that if you look at what Edmonton's innovative scenes are, there's one on the side of games and there's one on the side of AI. Do you think that that's you're traveling a similar set of spaces? Do you think that that's coincidence, or do you think that they're related?
It's interesting because, of course, famously, like Demis Hassabis at DeepMind was also a gaming background person. It's hard to say. There certainly some aspects of being all about virtual worlds and simulations that plays a little bit into it, but it's a little bit of a stretch. I think it might be more fundamental that the people that are overjoyed at the technology of games, it's this general sort of optimism about what you can do with technology, and you've gone through the feedback cycle of getting this huge reward and joy from solving a wonderful technical problem, and it causes you to delve deeper into it and push harder on it. And it does, in some degree, give you confidence or maybe even hubris to think that you can make a difference in some of the other areas.
Cool. So this partnership with Rich, I'm kind of curious. All disclosures. I was I was also a co-author on the paper of the Alberta Plan with Rich and Patrick. But I want to ask you, have you read the Alberta Plan?
So I hadn't before I started talking with Rich. So I was familiar with. I had gone through his textbook, twice actually, and I loved his bitter lesson paper, and I had caught like a couple of his presentations, but I was several years behind on sort of the research work that he was doing, and I had my mental model of Richard Sutton had a few things that I had some concerns about from my view of reinforcement learning from several years back. And when I started talking with him and started going on like all of his more recent work, I got most of my concerns there were pretty much allayed, and it was kind of surprising how aligned we were on a lot of things.
Okay, if you could pick one thing that you think the Alberta Plan gets right and one thing that you think the Alberta Plan gets totally wrong.
Yeah.
I'm setting you guys up for success.
Yeah. So I have concerns that the monolithic nature of the models that are talked about there may not capture some important aspects of the way human brains work as a much more distributed, semi-consensus finding system. I mean, we draw these neat boxes about here's state, here's policy, and implemented with monolithic models, we have Turing equivalents on a lot of these things, and I won't say anything can't get across the finish line, but I do like to at least gesture in the direction of our one existence proof of general intelligence with biology and say that there is much less of a central driving force behind these things, that I believe they operate more at these somewhat lower levels. And I don't have this resolved, but that's always a concern for me when we've all stepped back away from anything smelling of symbolism, but there's still monolithic tendencies that I think may yet prove to be a little bit of a retardant for it. But the important things about what an AI does is digest its experience into a state representing, its view of the world and how it predicts things going forward and how it needs to have motivations both internally and externally imposed. These are core that are completely unaddressed by the current sensation with the large language models. These take a very, very wide context and they throw something at it and you get an answer out the end. And there's enormous value. I don't want to take anything away from everything that's being done with that, but that's not how our brains are working. And I think that there are important things that it doesn't encompass. And yet every lab in the world is throwing so much of the dominant share of their resources at that. So being a little bit contrarian, both of us, I think is a positive thing.
Yeah, I'm glad you used that word. That seems like a word when I first thought of you and Rich. I was like, well, those two things I know you're aligned on, being contrarian, but I don't know if you can be aligned on being contrarian. I'm going to ask you one more question, but I'll say that I'm going to open this up to the audience for questions after this last question, and the microphone, I believe, is over here. So if you want to rush to get in line to ask a question, I'll let you do that while I ask my last question to John, which is, what's your future? You talked a little bit about 2030 as being a goal of we might see some AGI, but maybe you could describe when you say there's a 50 to 60% chance that it happens by 2030, paint me a picture of what happens looks like.
So it does appear that I'm a person of decade-long efforts where there's a spectrum of useful there. There's a lot of people that have 18-month kind of passions and cycle through, and you get more breadth with that. But I've been a fairly in-depth person, overlapping with gaming and rocketry and virtual reality and now AI, and I fully expect this to consume a decade of my life or more. So I certainly wouldn't give up in less than a decade, and if things are going well, it'll carry on longer than that. I do intend us to stay intentionally away from anything smacking of commercial product. I think that it is important. So this is one of the things I do struggle with a lot, though. I mean, there are all of these things. I'm far from having this, surety of direction or anything. One of the problems that I had a lot at Meta was a lot of the research I thought was actually not particularly valuable, that it was building for things, and I wanted everyone to concentrate just on product. You have product, there's a million things you can do, just do those million things. Don't look too far ahead. And yet here I am doing exactly the opposite. And I have the arguments with myself. Do I have a legitimate reason why this is different, or should I just be doing some data generation startup? The 10 companies that want me to help them do game generation with generative AI. There's tens of millions of dollars just to be had at the drop of a hat to go do something like that. And I can't say with surety that that's not true, that you don't learn as much along the way building those skills there. But my hunch, my bet that I'm making with this company and putting my effort into it is that there are a number of things that are very important that are not immediately commercially valuable that contribute to the big brass ring of the big deal there. So we have, just today we spent most of the day at white rooms, at conference rooms, kind of talking about finding out what areas we're aligned on, what areas we think need to be explored, hashing out a little bit of differences in understanding on some of the questions. But I have a series of things that I'm building up that I hope will demonstrate to me that we're at least on the right track. But in the end, you want to get something that winds up being sort of a virtual being that you can delegate tasks to, that's not just a chat bot, it's not just a tool that you use, but it starts winding up being options in remote employees for companies, where you have the option of like, oh, I liked working with AI Tom before, I'll take 5 more of him, put them on the different tasks here. And that's, at the end result, so many of the things that humans do now are mediated by computer interactions. And the pandemic really did put quite a point on that, where more things than people would have thought possible 5 years ago really are capable of being done just through the computer intermediation. And I think that, that is the opportunity to have this golden age of creative power and ability with magnifying all of that.
Awesome, thanks. I didn't see anyone walk over to the microphone, which I told you, there's no hand raising, just to be clear. There's no hand raising. You have to walk to the microphone.
take it away.
Hello, thank you so much. So I have a question about kind of this path towards artificial general intelligence, and I'll kind of frame it in terms of Quake. So in Quake, you have fast inverse square root, which was a method that no one would have thought of to do this process much more efficiently. So I'm wondering, when you think towards the path of artificial general intelligence, how much of it do you think is these ideas that no one was thinking of that are just a little bit more efficient than before? And how much of it is kind of a combination of ideas that we already have and that are floating around our circles?
Yeah, so there's some interesting aspects to the question of efficiency where I have to guard my time to not spend too much time on optimization because, I love that work. It's like a vacation for me to have something so clear, just make this number go down. That's like fun for me, but it's not the most important thing because in so many ways, making something 2 times faster, 4 times faster, even 10 times faster, if it's not on the critical path, that's probably not the right thing to do now. Now, where it does matter, you get into factors of 100 and 1,000, and there are architectural choices that you make that have these 3+ orders of magnitude importance. And those are important that you not mess those up, that you not do something. And there are architectures that you could make that are just going to be like involve pointer chasing or something that are just not going to be good enough because 3 orders of magnitude matters. You can't run your experiments in time, you can't deploy it and all that. But on the other hand, there are some architectures that may be important that just because they're not easily expressed as tensors in PyTorch or JAX or whatever, that people shy away from because you only build the things that the tools you're familiar with are capable of building. And I do think there is potentially some value there for architectures that, as a low-level programmer that's comfortable writing just raw CUDA and managing my own network communications for things, there are things that I may do that others wouldn't consider. And like one of the aspects is the boundaries that we put on the things that we're going to do. One of my boundaries is it has to be able to run in real time. Maybe not from my very first experiment, but if I can't manage a 30 hertz, 33 millisecond sort of training update for a continuous online learned algorithm, then I probably won't consider it because I do consider that necessary for even while you might grow in a simulated world, at some point, people aren't going to really buy it until they're having a Zoom call with the AI and, and poking it in various ways and having conversations. So that ability to run in real time goes against the current grain because things are moving up to you use a warehouse full of computers, but your step time might be 1.5 seconds or something. There are alternate ways of structuring your systems such that you use a warehouse full of computers and you get a 30 millisecond time, but you can't do that with the tools that most people are using today. So I hope that it does have some benefit, but that's one of those speculative things. My background may let me do something that might be important, but I can't say with any confidence that it actually is critical.
That's awesome. Thank you very much.
All right, next question.
Hey there, John. So I'm a huge fanboy. I just wanted to say thank you for everything and you've done for this industry, and specifically thank you for building Quake.
Excellent.
Quake was a very important game for me for both my social and professional life. Thank you. But my question is about who in this world has the ability to build the next great thing? In my mind, throughout history of computers, there's always been like a sole person or a small team that, and not some giant corporation that has really pushed things forward. Every programming language was created by like 1 or 2 people. There's Linux. Google was famously started by 2 dudes in a garage. Your former employer, Facebook, was created by 1 guy or 1 set of twins, depending on who you ask. And I basically believe you created a lot of these technologies on your own. But when we look towards AI and VR, there seems to be like these huge requirements for enormous amounts of data, big training sets, multi-million-dollar compute time. So I ask, can a small team still build the next great thing?
So there are, I would say most projects in the world of importance actually do need larger teams and resources. Building commercial infrastructure, building highways, these take large teams. And even in the software side of things, building Chrome takes a large team. Building Android takes a large team. And these are super important things that the world runs on to some degree. So the default state is it probably needs a lot of people for these big things. But my point about AI or AGI right now being this potentially unique point of high leverage comes from my belief that I have this whole set of spiel about how the data is not that large, the compute's probably not that large in the larger scheme of things. Like a point I make, a year of life is 1 billion frames at 30 frames per second. And that fits on a thumb drive. And you can tell that a 1-year-old is a conscious, intelligent being. So it does not require all the data on the internet to demonstrate artificial general intelligence if your algorithm is correct.
I see.
The arguments about how much compute you may need are, I don't have as ironclad positions about that, but I have plenty of reason to believe, based on the capabilities of what the networks are doing today and the size of the brain and the parts that we think we understand what's going on, that it is not a warehouse full of computers. I mean, I don't think it's one node or even one rack, but in that scale, over the course of the coming decade, we will factor that by, it'll be another order of magnitude less. And I do think it's inevitable, but there is this period where well-heeled individuals right now can potentially take a crack at this. If none of us make it, then eventually it's going to get to the point where every grad student has the resources to take a stab at these problems, and the problem will fall shortly after that point if it hasn't fallen before that. But I think we're in this magical time right now where it is a golden opportunity, and I'm honestly surprised that there aren't more people. I mean, there are hundreds of people like me that were technical people that, that succeeded, sold companies, have the resources to go and apply this. And I'm kind of surprised that there aren't more of them taking small stabs at it, because even if you think you've got 0.1% chance of kind of making it and getting all the way, it's kind of a Pascal's wager sort of thing where the expected value from that, if you have no fear of ruin, is still quite significant.
Great answer. Thank you so much.
Hello, John. So I understand that the AGI goal might seem a little bit abstract. So my question goes towards, if you're taking steps towards this goal, how are you making sure how are you measuring your progress? Are you decomposing it into sub-problems? Like, what are the proofs or the steps? Or maybe abstractly, how are you sure you are going to be making progress towards this 2030 goal?
Yeah, so I'm not at all sure about it, and it is almost one of the key questions. How do you gauge whether your child is growing properly? Do you have things that are crude, like the basic responsiveness tests about things? You track pupil movement, but how do you tell at the earliest level, before 1 billion steps have gone by, what level of cognitive processing is going on there? And I have, my angles on this involve, moving foveas and centers of attention, and there's low-level things that I can look at and say, I believe an intelligence should be following these patterns, and I have these indirect measures that I can make of it. But I dearly wish that I had better objective measures, because it's undervalued how critical benchmarks were to the pace of this last decade of terrific AI progress, where turning things from a discussion section into numeric values, and yes, there's downsides, and people talk about grad student dissent and the problems with leaderboards and different things like that, but overall it's been enormously valuable. And I do worry a little bit, even with the LLMs, that I don't really buy a lot of the measures of how they're benchmarked against each other, and it's an even harder problem for AGI. So I wish I had a better answer to that, because I think it's important. But I think that there's at least directions that we can be following that we feel pretty good about, but it's entirely possible years could go by and it turns out it was the wrong direction, but it's still worth the try.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.
Yeah, I had a question about the kind of AGI you visualize building at Keen. So when I think about AGI, I think there's an embodiment, there's an actual robot functioning in the real world. So are you thinking about something which is animal-like or human-like, or is it completely virtual?
All right, so I'm not a fan of robots, which puts me at odds with Joseph here. And it comes from, of course, I'm the virtual reality guy, so I believe in simulation and the general ability to to do valuable things in simulation. While robotics puts much of the value of working with robots is this discipline of saying you're going to be real time, you're working with reality. You can't just get slower and slower and make your model better by scaling it in a way contrary to time. So I think that discipline can still be maintained in a virtual environment. And I think that's the primary benefit. And there's a lot of downsides to robots where I did spend over a decade building rocket ships, and that drives home sort of the cussedness of physical things. And the less you can be forced to work with physical objects, the better in most cases. So I think in general, I don't expect us to be doing anything robot-based. Now, the question of exactly what simulated environment you have, there's a broad range there where, like right now, I'm working with sort of this 2D infinite movie wall of like moving around, looking at different things. And there's a degree of agency there, and you can learn about 3D environments and you can put 3D games inside there. But to me, like it's an open question, should it be a virtual reality environment of instead of a virtual 2D wall, should it be a physical space where they have to like walk around essentially to look at different things? And I don't know. I'm leaning towards the simpler possibilities right now. But if it turns out that I wind up making a full-fledged game engine rendered virtual world, I wouldn't be at all surprised if that's where we wind up in a year or two.
Cool. Thank you.
Thanks, John. So it's very special to have you joining our community here in Edmonton. And when Rich emailed you, you must have thought to yourself whether you wanted to start this partnership, and obviously you did. So I was wondering about what were the behaviors that you saw in this community that wanted to make you join our community, and more broadly, like what should we hold on to? Because we might have taken it for granted because we've been fostering it for so long.
Yeah, so the initially I did not get my hopes up. I was just like, hey, it's cool to be having a communication with Richard Sutton, and I was going to try to be my helpful self as much as I could be. And the fact that we did wind up hitting it off well enough that it's almost remarkable how many areas of overlap that we've got in terms of the way we look at this. And in some ways, both me in Dallas and Rich up here in Alberta, this is not the center of gravity of artificial intelligence research. We are in our own way in the wilderness, and I think there's some commonality that came from that, where there is this kind of fashion in research and especially in the commercial side of it, and the current looking at things like the reinforcement learning and the real-time online continuous learning, these are not the current fashion for things. Great strides are being made with large language models, large batch training, slow steps, inference only, and that's all great. But everybody should be aware that this is not the be-all, end-all. It doesn't solve all of the problems. So somebody's still got to be looking for the remaining answers. We don't have them all. So being willing to go against the grain and to step a little bit outside and have a lot of people say, why are you working on that? That's not the mainstream. That's not where you can go impress the VCs or whatever. But at some point, somebody has to solve some of these problems. And, the willingness to go ahead and do that because you think that it's the right long-term solution. It's, I do tip my hat to the kind of the academic virtues of you are trying to find truth. You're trying to find, the knowledge and the way to solve these problems in the hopes that then they will be applied into the world to produce, great value across the different areas. But yeah, the biggest thing right now is we're both outside the mainstream, but we both have conviction and we have, reason to believe that it's a profitable direction to be pursuing. And this is far from the only direction. Again, I'm surprised that there aren't more efforts like this going on, rather than having the 10th company training their own large language model to compete with something. There are other interesting problems that may wind up being even more important. And being excited about the general technology while kind of picking a path that's not just following somebody else's trail in the specifics, I think is important. The world needs more people like that.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Hello. I'm very excited to hear about this partnership that you have here. And so one of the things that I like about it is that there's a lot of blue sky research that you sort of have in mind, right? That for the next 7, 10 years, whatever, there's going to be a lot of focus on these fundamental things, some maybe online real-time algorithms to do certain things. But you also emphasize that there is no need for a tangible product in, let's say, in this time frame, right? So all of this sounds very much like an academic lab, and while this is certainly not one, right? And perhaps, so my question is, out of curiosity, that is this something you're specifically guarding against? Because like DeepMind and companies like this also started with a similar, perhaps, intention, right? That lots of blue sky research, solve intelligence, use that to solve everything else. But now maybe it's not exactly the same anymore, right? So are you specifically guarding against that, or is that something you don't really think about?
So I am unashamedly a capitalist. I do think that this could make me a trillionaire if everything goes well. It's worth kind of aiming for some things that producing value. I think it's good for the world. I mean, I deeply believe that building commercial enterprises is most of what has made the world what it is today in a very positive sense. So, and I don't have the academic background. I recognize I'm standing on the shoulders of all of the academic work that's been done before. And it was funny because I talked to, a head of a university one time, and I was kind of mentioning how I feel a little guilty being a commercial company that is built on lots of this research. And he said, your tax dollars have paid for a whole lot of this research. Don't feel bad at all. This is the point of all of this, is to let people try to build on it. So, it is a commercial effort, and part of that was a focusing tool for myself, where I spent kind of the prior few years in what I called Victorian gentleman scientist mode. I was kind of styled like Darwin or Babbage, where I'm a rich guy that can buy all the scientific tools that he needs and can kind of have my backyard laboratory for things. And, I learned a whole lot. I spent the time kind of going through this extended larval stage about finding out what everybody is up to and getting myself up to the modern standards there. But it always gave me an out. Just at that level, I could think of it, it's like, well, it's almost a hobby. I could just quit at any time. I can divert my time any way that I want. And I had several different organizations pestering me about form a company, take our investment money. And I didn't need it for the money, but I looked at it as a focusing tool where I have, in many ways, an overactive sense of responsibility to investors. It killed me at Meta just seeing all that money going out when I'm like, no, turn it into profitable businesses earlier. So that is an aspect of it. And then hiring employees means it's like, okay, now I've got people's paychecks that I am responsible for. So it makes me focus better on the tasks at hand, as well as actually bringing the resources to bear. So yeah, in some ways it's a pure research play, but at some point it turns into, if it works, products that really literally reshape the world.
Thank you.
So I think you touched on this a bit earlier, but I'm sure many people have tried to hire Dr. Sutton before and failed. And so, could you talk a bit more about why you succeeded where no one else could? And was it fully attributed to being aligned, or?
Yeah, so I still wind up being happily surprised that I'm here today with this, because a couple of times I just said, I know you can write your own ticket anywhere. You can go to any of these companies, and everybody would be happy to have the father of modern reinforcement learning just in their collection. And for some big companies, it is almost like a Pokemon collection, collect your favorite researchers and, make sure they're on your team and your deck. Yeah. But I think, part of it is that we want to actually do these things. It's not about prestige and being out there and kind of staking a claim. We want it to exist. We want to build it. And I think that there is a sense that a smaller team, there's all sorts of drags and friction that you get in big teams. It is wonderful to have a 10,000 GPU cluster that you can go ahead and just kind of get time on whenever you feel like it. But I've got enough options for doing things like that that I don't think that's going to hold us back. And the ability to have a purity of focus, I think, is important. But yeah, I'm still really very happy that it all worked out this way.
Thank you.
Hello. Thank you so much for the talk, John. It was fantastic. So my question goes back to the discussion about game development and open source. And I would like to hear your opinion about what do you see as the future of open source software in the video game industry, especially since it's a world full of IPs and proprietary platforms?
So there is, right now is an interesting inflection point because Unity had their whole change their terms of services, and this is making a lot of people reevaluate what they're doing. And it's been a long time since I was really close to the work being done on the open source engines. But I believe it's fair to say that Unity, with all their employees, they do a lot to make it a comfortable, cozy development experience. They do provide a lot of value. And you do get a lot of open source crusaders that just don't acknowledge the value that the commercial companies bring to the table when they build their software, because there are a lot of blind spots that the open source teams, it's weird how the DNA of the people that are willing to work on open source wind up with certain important blind spots in the kind of applicability of their software and the usability. You make super powerful tools, but they're not very comfortable, and it winds up making them not the right call for a lot of people. But like I said, I very much respect Epic's in-between position, where even if you don't pay them a cent, you can read every line of code and learn from it and understand how things work. You can pay reasonable license fees. Having competition there is great, letting people choose. And I always thought that the trade-offs between Unity and Unreal was a nice market balance to have. And like in virtual reality, 95% of the developers wound up with Unity because of just the crowd that was attracted. But it was always expected that if you need serious control, you'd then go with Unreal and you could write things at a lower level. So there's an opportunity now. I think there will inevitably be some larger move after Unity's stumble here to open source projects. I don't expect it to be a tsunami that accelerates and takes over everything, because there are just so many of these grubby business things that are just not fun to do on the open source projects that I could imagine a scenario where somebody like Meta gets behind open source things and winds up helping do some of the unpopular, unfun things for their own kind of self-interested reasons that could be positive. But I think I'm resigned to a slow pace of migration towards more open source tools. Again, at this point, 30 years back, I'm disappointed that we aren't further along there relative to compiler tool chains and things, where the world is a better place for having those be almost universally open source. And we probably could have been there on some game engine type things, but I don't think the fundamental reasons why we're not have changed. So I think it's going to be modest changes going forward still.
Thank you so much.
Okay.
I'm being told we're almost out of time, and we have a line of 6 people, so I'm going to go into lightning round mode, and you get 10 seconds to ask your question. And John,
I can
gets
actually
30
hang around a
seconds
little
to
bit
answer.
after the actual official end. So.
Okay, well, so I worked with Mike and Rich at DeepMind, and actually some friends and I left DeepMind to create a startup here in town using AI to make AI in video games. So first of all, thank you for not shooting to make a commercial product in the next couple of years in the AI and game space. But my question is more I know Rich has a really strong commitment to open research, and it sounds like you embrace that as well with the hacker mentality. So what are the plans for Keen to share your insights, your breakthroughs, and maybe even your code?
So this was, one of the significant conversations that we had, and Rich does understand the importance of commercial businesses, and that there's reasons why these are fundamentally important, and the incentives matter. And there's the talk about yes, I did champion a lot of releases of different things, and there's certain technologies that I'm happy to have us publish. There's other things more around experiment design and architectures that I probably don't want us talking about. And it's going to be in a situation if somebody wants to write a paper about something, we'll have a conversation about it. And if it's something at the very tactical level, hey, this is an interesting way to do an optimizer, this is another way to calculate your TD assignments, whatever,
that's probably fine. But here is the architecture of what our proto-AI, AGI looks like. That's probably not going to be talked about because all of these are going to be things that we see it today where all of the major laboratories, they can reproduce anybody else's work with a couple sentences of direction and a couple weeks of time. And I think that's going to be the case for AGI as well. When it does all get solved, the textbook from the future is going to have a relatively thin chapter about this is actually all that's really required, built on the baseline to make it happen. So yeah, there's some sense of secrecy. And then there's real concerns about any real company is going to have employee turnover. They're going to walk out the door, NDA or not, they're going to know what the things are. So there is a large part of this gamble on, even if all of this value gets developed, much of it may dissipate into the broader world, which is great for the world, not so great for my investors, but we're all still collectively willing to take that risk.
Thank you.
Okay, it looked like lightning round didn't work, so I'm gonna call it here because we're out of time. But John has very generously offered to answer some questions if you have some. We'll make sure we start with this line first.
Yeah.
But let's first thank John for telling us so much insight about his past, present, and future.
All right.
Thanks.
Do I have to vacate the stage?
Yeah, I don't know what we do next. Thank you. Bye.